Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot, and a lot of you have asked me to cover the Air India Flight 171 crash on my channel, which was the 787-8 that crashed in Ahmedabad about a month ago. Now, originally I did not want to do that because there was no factual information available and most of what we would do would be guesswork. But the preliminary report has just been released and therefore let's go ahead and go over the contents of that report, and I'm also going to give a couple of personal opinions here which I'm going to clearly mark as such. Now, we're going to start with what a preliminary report is. The ICAO Annex 13, that's the one that deals with air crashes and their investigations, demands that a preliminary report is released 1 month after the crash or accident of an aircraft. And therefore, the preliminary report has just been released now. Now, a preliminary report is not a complete air crash investigation, much rather it contains the basic facts that have been established so far, and it gives you some sort of idea of what might have been going on, but it will probably not contain any final theories. So, the report is available for free on the website of the Accident Investigation Bureau of the Ministry of Civil Aviation of India. And I'm going to link it in the video description below so that you can read it yourself. It contains 15 pages, and if we have a look into the content, then we can see it's based on these standards that are demanded by Annex 13. So it gives general information, then background injuries, aircraft information, damages, and so on. Now, in today's report, we can basically skip all of that because that is public knowledge by now. And the really interesting thing is going to be down here in chapter number 12, Accident Flights. So let's go down here and have a look. So there's lots of information in here. Basically, the interesting stuff after establishing all the facts, like when did the crew arrive, and even over here the crew underwent a standard breathalyzer test, which is normal procedure nowadays. Those tests are operated on a random basis. So this is not indicative of any abuse or something, it's just standard that this happens every now and then. Happened to me as well already. It's just normal that you have to do this. Now, after all this type of general information, the report really gets interesting down here on page number 14. So, basically the aircraft went airborne, and over here the aircraft achieved a maximum recorded airspeed of 118 knots at about time, and immediately thereafter the engine 1 and engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to the cutoff position with a time gap of approximately 1 second. So that's the key sentence in this entire report so far. Now, let's quickly visualize what exactly has happened there. So basically the aircraft went airborne, and when reaching 180 knots, someone turned the fuel control switches to off. The reason has not been established in the report, and what has been established, and we can take a very quick look at that right within the report, is that the voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking why did he cut off. The other pilot responded that he did not do so. And this is kind of the key statement of the entire report. So basically, after takeoff, the switches were turned to cutoff, which shut down the engines a couple seconds after the aircraft lifted off, and the rest of the entire flight is known. Now, there are lots of theories going on in the internet in regards to why the switches may have been turned off. Could this have been a pilot suicide? Could this have been a terrorist attack or whatever? Now, it is important to note that none of this is confirmed at the moment. Any of this is just speculation. To me personally, and that's my own theory, the idea of both pilots talking about, hey, why did you turn the fuel cutoff switches off? I didn't, suggests that something may have happened accidentally as well. And indeed, there is a rather big topic of discussion going on in the airline world about accidental moving of cockpit controls. Airbus even has an entire article in their Safety First magazine that I'm going to link in the video description below about cockpit control confusion. And they have a case study over here which we can look into for a moment because it may support the theory of an accidental moving of the fuel control switches. And over here basically an aircraft started with pushback, the ground control instructed the first officer to set the parking brake to off. Then they started the pushback, and when the first officer wanted to start engine 1, he inadvertently set the parking brake handle to on. Now, Airbus then analyzed that the movement of the switches was rather similar, so turning the engine start selector to the right to ignition or turning the parking brake to the right to set it on is kind of a similar movement, and the controls are in similar places. So stuff like this has happened in the past. There is another incident here on the aviation safety network about an EasyJet Airbus A320 that was taking off when, after liftoff, the pilot flying asked the pilot monitoring to select the landing gear to up, but he moved the flap selector to position 0 instead. The error was realized and corrected, but stuff like this has already happened and isn't entirely new to the airline world. Now, the question is, could anything have happened that made one of the two pilots reach down here and accidentally flip those switches? That is something for the investigators to determine. It is impossible to say for someone who wasn't on board what may have happened there, except for the air crash investigators. So we're not going to speculate about this. However, one thing that I can say from my personal experience with fuel control switches like this, remember I flew the 737 for several years and we had the very same fuel control switches in the 737, both in the NG and in the MAX. And on the 737 it would be possible, when moving those switches forward, to accidentally place them on a middle position. Now, you can't typically see this in flight simulations because you can see the switches just move back and forth in flight simming. But in the real world, you need to pull them out about a millimeter, then you move them forward across a stop that's located in the middle of the switch. That's a physical stop that's built into the switch, and you have to lift the switch up and move it above that stop. And on the 737 it would be possible to actually put the switch down exactly on the very top of that stop. And therefore, as part of the after start checklist, when we set fuel control switches idle detent, we would just touch the switches and move them a little bit to verify that they would be correctly in the run position and not on the very top of that stop, where with a little bit of turbulence or with the aircraft shaking a little bit, perhaps a little bit of nose wheel shimmy, when we have a high pitch, they might just fall back into the cutoff position. So for this very reason, you had that stop detent, and you would just touch the switch and move it a little bit to verify that it's really within the run position. And this is something that you would do, and something where I could imagine the 787 to have the very same structure of the switch. Now, the report clearly says the switches were moved into the cutoff position, and the fact that there was a second in between moving the two switches suggests to me that they were consciously moved by a pilot and not accidentally placed on that middle position like I just described from my 737 experience. Now, why would a pilot reach down here and operate some switches a couple seconds after liftoff? I don't know. That's for the investigators to determine. And they do have an aviation psychologist as part of the air crash investigation team. You can actually see that in the original report as well. So when you go up here a little bit on one of the pages, it does say who is investigating this. And we can see over here that, amongst others, they have an aviation psychologist and an aviation medicine specialist as part of the investigator team. So the investigation clearly will be moving into that direction, determining why the fuel switches were moved to the cutoff position. One final thing that is definitely interesting in regards to the further proceeding of the flight. In flight simulation, we all know that you may accidentally touch a control, then you just reverse it and the problem solves itself. And obviously that is what was done on the real flight as well. We can see down here in the actual report that the fuel control switches were set back into the run position a couple of seconds after they were turned off. And the engines actually began spooling up after that, and we can see over here that the EGT was observed to be rising for both engines, indicating relight. So by the time the aircraft crashed into the building, the engines were already accelerating again and the aircraft was already restarting. However, unfortunately it was too late and we all know what happened afterwards. Now, the very end of the report tells us the progress of the investigation, and this is a good idea to look forward into what's going to happen next. And we can see over here what was done already. The wreckage side was documented, the engines were retrieved, components of further interest were retrieved, fuel samples were taken from the Bowsers that were used to refuel the aircraft, and very limited amount of fuel samples were actually taken from the wreckage itself, aka from the APU filter and the refueling jettison valve of the left wing. They also downloaded the flight data recordings and collected statements of the witnesses, and they started to analyze the corpses of the crew and the passengers. And then basically, it says that additional detail will be gathered during the investigation. Right now, they have no safety recommendations for the 787 or the GEnx engines. So that basically says the airplane or the engines have nothing where they could say this is dangerous, this has to be improved right now, which is really important since there were quite a lot of speculations about a problem with the aircraft right after the accident, but it seems like there is nothing the like. It doesn't seem to be Boeing's fault at the moment, and the investigation is continuing and the team will review and examine additional evidence. And that's the end of the preliminary report. Now this is quite normal. This is about the amount of information that you can expect from such a preliminary report. How could this potentially go forward? Obviously, different theories are going to be analyzed. They will analyze whether it might have been an accidental operation of the fuel control switches. They will analyze if it may have been an intentional act. And I'm sure that they will also analyze if there could be any potential additional safety barrier that could be built in to prevent something like this from happening again. If my first theory would prove true, that it was indeed an accidental operation of the fuel control switches, then they will surely think about, could we do something to prevent this from happening again? And such a solution may, for example, be a software solution that the computer simply is not going to shut off the fuel to the engines if the switches are moved into the cutoff position in certain conditions. Surely they are not going to inhibit this entirely, but perhaps after takeoff until a certain altitude. And this kind of stuff is going to be analyzed by the air crash investigators. Again, I can't tell you any definite findings or solutions they will come up with, but what I can say is that they are going to analyze all of this and more, and the final report is probably going to come within a couple of years, as is usually the case in aviation. We may see some further intermediate reports ahead of time. We may not. That is not as clearly regulated as it is with the preliminary report that has to be released a month after the accident. From now on, things are going to slow down, but I'm sure when they make big progress, when they establish something like it was an intentional act, that is definitely going to be released into the public. But we have to wait and see what's actually going to come out of the investigation from now on. Well, and that's all the information that is in there for the time being, at least all the information that I would call relevant to the accident. So thank you very much for watching. Leave your comment underneath, tell me what you think of those theories and if you've heard any other. And for the time being, thank you very much for watching. As always, like the video if you liked its contents, comment to let me know your thoughts, and subscribe if you're up for more. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.